we'll kickstart because we've got a lot to get through. And I know we usually start 1 minute past the hour, but I'm going to actually break with convention here and start on the dot of 11. And I know that might actually give me palpitations here, but if we do start, we've got best endeavours. We'll cover off the material that we've got to share with you in the hour so far. So welcome to Consumer Duty 12 months on. What now and what next? And yes, if you've recovered from the football and also the electioneering, then welcome to this webinar. And just before you get your bucket and spade ready and prepared for your seaside visit to sunny Blackpool, yep, sunny still, then this might actually either cancel that holiday or actually supercharge that holiday, depending how you feel. So we've got some polls, we've got some questions, got some challenges throughout this hour that we've got. Delighted to welcome us to share their thoughts and insights over the next hour with Kate and Zoe at Avyse Partners. Welcome back, Avyse. Great partners that we have. Our CEO, Adrian Harvey from Elephants Don't Forget, and also guest speaker, Chris Adlard, Consumer Duty Manager at Newbury Building Society, and to share his wisdom nuggets with us about the practical applications of how he has embedded consumer duty within the organisation. As you know, as ever, if you're a groupie of Elephants Don't Forget webinars, therefore you know that you have the opportunity to sign up to our podcasts, our webinars, and our thought leadership. We'll be sending you a PDF version of the slides there afterwards, as well as a recording. We'll also post the feedback through the poll question that we kindly invite you to share or participate in. This is what we're going to be talking about. What does good look like? And what are the best practices that we've all seen within the marketplace over the last 12 months? Also, you know what? There's that thing called preparing and submitting and signing off of your board report at the end of the month, if you didn't know. So let's go into a few details about that through the time that we have. Also demonstrating ongoing compliance to the duty, as well as embedding and reinforcing that throughout your culture over the next 12 months and beyond there. So yeah, let's get started. Let's ask a very simple question. It took us ages to think of this question there, but I think that it would be a great opportunity for you to be able to see whether we can actually get an understanding of where you are with your board reports as such there. So have you managed to get your first consumer duty board report to your board? Yes or no? Chris, you must be chuffed because you posted it on LinkedIn that you're first out the gate there.
Well, we were very pleased to have completed it. It was definitely a sense of relief, but it's been 2 years in the making. So, and I think someone commented on my post, you know, it's the end of one journey, but it's the start of the next. So, yeah, obviously pleased. And I can see, I'm sure there are many people on this webinar that have already completed their report as well. So congrats to everyone who's done the same.
Kate, signed, sealed and delivered by people that you're working with?
Not everyone yet, I think is fair to say. I think we're seeing quite a lot of iterations. So maybe the board's received their first version and there are second versions going in for review. I think some firms have underestimated quite how much effort it takes to get this first board report ready. It isn't a small feat and it carries a lot of weight with the regulator and with you as a business. So its importance should not be underestimated.
Adrian, especially if you shouldn't underestimate that, especially if you're in car finance as well.
Yes, we were discussing earlier. We saw a survey, 889 car dealers of a survey that was conducted didn't know they had to file their board report on the 31st of July. That's pretty fundamental.
That's the tumbleweed moment.
Yeah. And I think it'll be the first test for the regulator. Have you actually got a board report? Yes or no? So make sure there is one by the 31st of July.
Go on.
I don't know how you respond to that, Kate.
Me too. It's almost flabbergasting. But, you know, then you've got to look at it in respect to the car dealers. There are probably quite a lot of very small firms there. And I think I've got a considerable sympathy for some of the smaller firms who are, you know, potentially not one-man bands, but real small firms that they trade under the same legislation. It's a huge burden.
Zoe, second question that we've got on screen. How satisfied are you with the quality, depth and accuracy of your Consumer Duty Board report there? As Kate alluded to in the first question, you know, there's a lot riding on this, and more than potentially firms do realise, as the regulator will be comparing and contrasting your board report with others in your industry.
Yeah, so we've seen a range of quality in the board reports that we've been reviewing, and we know that the FCA have requested to see a number of them by the end of August. You know, from the reports I've seen, I guess the key observation is whereby firms have got various comments and views from various individuals across the business. For example, their consumer duty champion, their management opinion, the second line opinion, and they're not always aligned, you know, in terms of openness and communications across the business. You've got some where a very positive spin has been put onto the implementation of consumer duty and where the firm is, with the absence of any mention of any poor customer outcomes or any, you know, outstanding actions. Whereas another opinion within the pack suggests that there are issues. So I guess, you know, having that consistency across and making sure that, you know, there's that communication and openness across the business. And that demonstrates that there's effective governance controls in place, that these messages are being conveyed and there's no surprises at the end.
Okay. Chris, were you satisfied? How would you put yourself on this poll? How satisfied are your board with the depth, quality and accuracy?
I would like to think they were pretty satisfied. Going back to Zoe's point, we've given the board kind of monthly updates around consumer duty over the last 18 months. And so the board report hasn't really been a surprise. They're probably sick of hearing about what we're doing around consumer duty, to be honest. And they've had an opportunity to critique it. Our board champion has been heavily involved in helping question how we put it together, even the structure of it, and given us some great input. So I'd like to think we've done a pretty good job with it overall.
Adrian, 58% are satisfied with the board report content, depth and accuracy.
That's good. 76% of the car traders weren't. And I like this question because it's like, part of me just being contentious says, so what? I'm not entirely sure. I mean, the judge is the FCA, right? So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. I mean, this is a first punt by most firms, and there isn't a clear, it needs to look exactly like this. So to some degree, everyone who's answered that question has interpreted what's right and what good looks like. But we're going to bring that to life, hopefully, in this. Yeah. So you can then answer the question again at the end, and hopefully everyone will say, I'm super satisfied.
Yeah, I just want to focus on that. But Kate, 30% aggregating neither satisfied or dissatisfied, dissatisfied and very dissatisfied, aggregated 30%, you know, are probably not taking that holiday to Blackpool, are they?
Yeah, I think, you know, that 20% in neither satisfied nor dissatisfied reflects that expectations of these board reports is not being clear from the regulator yet. So it's really difficult to benchmark yourself in terms of, have I done a good job? I am sure that over the coming months, the regulator will be vocal in terms of what they've liked, what they've not liked. And it will be really important for firms to apply those learnings as they move forward, because this is definitely not once and done. This is forever after. So I do think firms have got quite the challenge on themselves to, are they really confident on what good is? Probably not, because you don't really know what good looks like in all cases yet. You can only do best efforts.
And referencing what the FCA is going to be putting out, there is an FCA webinar at the end of the month and 1 year on, so you want to dial into that. I'll send you details of that later. But we just haven't come here with a crash and a bang, have we, Kate? There's been a story, hasn't there? There's always a backstory, a history towards where we've come from and what we've gone through there. Summarise, if you would, there. The regulator hasn't been shy in coming forward about this regulation and the expectations thereafter.
Yeah, I would agree. I think fundamentally, consumer duty has been the drum that's been beaten by the regulator for the last 2-3 years. In terms of the storyboard of the last 12 months, I think they have been really helpful in sharing expectations as they move forward. So there's been a number of publications. Kind of more recently, one of them is that good practice and areas for improvement. And there was a gap analysis as well, a document around for insurers that applies to most finance firms in terms of data and MI and their expectations for outcome monitoring. If I was sat in a firm looking at what a good board report should look like and how to apply that, I would be looking at all those past papers from the FCA, because that's the best guidance you're going to get, and check and challenging yourselves against some of those statements. But the information is there from the regulator. It's just helpfully not in one checklist. You do have to do a bit of digging around and look at your Dear CEO letters, look at your publications, make sure you're listening to some webinars and build that knowledge base. So it's not easy for firms, but it's there if you look hard.
Chris, how does a firm like yours get on top of this? And then there's one thing to get on top of the regulation and the expectations of the Dear CEO letters. There's another thing to implement it and embed it.
I think what Kate said is bang on. I'm not saying Newbury's got it all right, but what we have done over the last 12 months is kind of listen to every webinar from the FCA, take all their publications, be on webinars like this. There's at least 1 or 2 a week on consumer duty, and try and note down the salient points. And that aggregation of salient points has helped guide our board report, because obviously, you've got loads of big consultancy firms that have said this is what a good board report looks like. Well, they're all different, but if you can get some key learnings from all of those things, then hopefully your board report's going to tick a lot of the boxes, even if the FCA hasn't been explicit in terms of what they want in there.
Adrian, are you still seeing consumer duty being led and run by the second line there?
I think it varies. I speak to a lot of firms, a lot of our customers who have perhaps a more holistic approach to it. I do speak almost every day to firms that have, my word, delegated the responsibility of consumer duty to somebody, a project team or someone to get this done. And for me, that's against the spirit of the legislation. This really should be a holistic thing. So for me, I look to customers who have done this right, in my opinion, it's an opinion, but in my opinion, who have done it right and it's genuinely owned by the board, top down, bottom up. And what that means is they've invested in ensuring their people are sufficiently competent to ensure good outcomes, rather than just some divorced project team producing a report and filing it and saying, right now, get on with work.
Yeah.
Firms are, I've seen from my perspective, second line often get given the responsibility. This is a regulatory requirement. Therefore, can you start off with the first draft? I think with consumer duty, what firms need to bear in mind that this goes across all those lines of defence. And I would expect the voice of the first line, the second line and the third line, if you have one, to be represented in that board report, because everyone holds responsibility. It isn't just one individual, it is a firm-wide responsibility.
Yeah. Chris, when we look at a recent survey by MoneyHub, obviously looked at 2,000 customers of retail banks and other organisations in FS there. The left column makes for grim reading, doesn't it?
Well, to be honest, I was actually really pleased with this study. I think 22% of customers saying they've seen a good outcome after 12 months of consumer duty being used in reality, I think is a tremendously positive thing. And I think customer transformation is a really hard bit of change that has to, as Adrian says, come from the board. It needs to be pushed throughout the whole organisation. And so for consumers already to notice an impact and an improvement is really positive. Clearly still a lot more work to do, but I would dispute the fact that this is a negative stat.
Okay.
I really agree with Chris's points. You know, in terms of what we're seeing, firms are definitely moving in the right direction, albeit some slower than others. But I haven't yet come across a firm that's been reluctant or refused to deliver good customer outcomes. I know, for example, a lot of firms are reviewing their customer communications. You know, we know that the customer communications in these businesses are vast, often in thousands. And I think what firms are starting to do is prioritise the communications posing the highest risk of harm. So it's really good that that's then playing through into the results. And I think, you know, one of the key elements here is to really drill down into the customer feedback to understand, you know, the root cause of the complaints, understand, you know, the responses to customer surveys that I know a lot of firms have sent out, and really act upon those points that are made to make improvements to the processes. And I just see this as sort of an iterative process that will evolve over time.
Fair enough. Yeah, thanks for contradicting me. That's the great thing about these webinars. I think that the most important thing is that we're challenging each other and challenging ourselves as well. But I really want to dig down into what does good look like, and with real world examples and there. Kate, when you look at perhaps what's keeping firms up at night around consumer duty, you're still finding that there's a misinterpretation or misalignment between interpreting and applying the cross-cutting rules. Why, after a year or so, is that difficult, or still difficult for firms to understand?
I think my view is that sometimes, somehow, they've just been a little lost. So there's been brilliant focus by firms on those 4 outcomes, which are really clearly set out in terms of who is my target market? Have I got price and value right? Have I got support right? Have I got understanding? What firms need to be cognizant of only when those 4 are together will you get to the place with your cross-cutting rules. Why are you doing all of that? Well, it's to meet the cross-cutting rules. It's to act in good faith. It's to avoid harm and to enable and support customers. And I think my message to firms is make sure you don't lose sight of those cross-cutting rules as you do all the hard and good work around delivering against those 4 underlying outcomes. Always link it back to make sure that there is that. It's like because you can have 1,000 metrics, and I've seen firms with pages and pages of like metrics of how we're meeting X, Y, and Z's outcome. Bring it back, make it clear. You know, from a board perspective, you want succinct, clear messages. They don't have time to focus on everything. You know, how have you avoided harm? What are your top 3 points this year in terms of what you've changed, what you've done to prevent harm? And I'd put those in as headlines in reports.
Zoe, you flagged that defining what good looks like, what a good outcome looks like, is still an issue. Why is that still an issue for firms?
I think the main issue here is that firms set out with really good intentions, and you know, as part of their implementation of consumer duty, they did define what a good customer outcome looked like. But I don't think this was fully embraced or built into their framework in terms of, you know, MI to measure progress against the defined customer outcomes that have been defined sort of in the context of their business, their products, and their target market. And it feels a little bit like the defined customer outcomes have been forgotten along the way, you know, in terms of they haven't been fully trained out to the first line staff, for example. So without that sort of consistent understanding of what a good customer outcome looks like, it's sort of drifted away a little bit. I think firms really need to get back to basics in terms of really, you know, defining what then good customer outcomes look like and making sure that's communicated and consistent across the business.
Adrian, capturing number 3, capturing the voice of the customer. I mean, you can never do enough really in that area to actually make sure that that is feeding back, as Zoe said, into the firm, refining and enhancing their processes and their systems and approaches there. Talk us through what that looks like from a training and development point of view.
Yeah, so I'm always cynical of surveys, right? Because you get survey junkies. McKinsey, I think the data point's like 7% of, of consumers fill in surveys. I know that, for me to fill in a survey, I know it's a terrible thing, isn't it? I only really fill in a survey if I have a shocking service. So that's the thing that triggers. So I think that the data is always wonky. It's always skewed in one way, shape, or form. There is possibly a stance that says, is it genuinely representative of our customer base? And I think actually, from a training and competence point of view, your people, your employees, the frontline staff, are probably best qualified to establish whether or not what you're doing is good. They know, they've got the pulse, their fingers on the pulse every day speaking to customers. Have you invested sufficiently in ensuring your people are sufficiently competent to understand whether or not, or what the regulation means in relation to the job they do? And have you got a culture where these people, your staff, the people who are serving your customers, can say, boss, we're doing a shit job, sorry, we're not doing a brilliant job, right? I'm picking up an undertone of dissatisfaction constantly in almost every call. That's way, way more valuable than any survey monkey junkie thing that you're doing to try and establish whether or not customers are getting good outcomes.
How are Newbury squaring that circle and that challenge, Chris, then, of delivering good outcomes?
I think the point Adrian made there about culture is absolutely key. And we obviously at Newbury, it's a member-owned organisation. So naturally, in the DNA of the company, it's always been about the customer and delivering an outcome that is satisfactory and good for the customer. So, to a certain degree, consumer duty, you're pushing on open doors. But one thing I would say is that across those 4 outcomes, and indeed obviously applying the cross-cutting rules across all 4, we've done a number of proactive initiatives to really ensure that test ourselves, in every meeting, is this really the right thing for the customer? Have we gone back to the customer and refunded fees where we felt that they were mischarged in the first place, even if that's what the contract they signed to start with? I think for us, it's been an opportunity to go above and beyond and just really, just at every point, get everyone thinking, okay, is this the right thing for the customer? So bottom line, I think it's culture at the end of the day.
And yeah, we invite your questions and also your challenges and also your comments there. You can do that 2 ways. First of all, through the chat, and also if you want to do it anonymously, and you can do that through the 2 speech bubbles, which is denoted in your toolbar there, to tick the anonymous box there, and you can pose your question. I think a couple of people have raised their hands. So if you want to actually just write out your question, we can do so as well there. Look, we all like a diagram, we all like a model, especially one around culture. So if you want to geek out like me on Charles Handy and Edgar Schein and all those other business gurus, then humour me for at least 30 seconds. So on the left-hand side here, you've got the enablers. So this is what the key drivers of the organisation to driving consumer duty forward through the organisation. On the right-hand side, you've obviously got the results and the outputs from the enablers there. I mean, it's a given that the regulator has prescribed on the left-hand side that leadership, the tone from the top that Adrian talks about, is critical to setting the stage and setting the right culture within your organisation. But I think that where people respond through their people, strategy, and also partnerships and resources will determine the success or failure of adhering to consumer duty. I noticed, Adrian, that many firms have committed themselves to consumer duty training. Has that, in your mind, actually been successful when they've implemented that through that change process or that project management team who've actually driven consumer duty forward?
I'm still trying to understand your diagram. So I'm just going to have to park that because it's really confusing me. So I don't think I'm just put my hand over that when I answer the question. It's just distracting me so much. And unfortunately, it's in our brand colour.
Such a Luddite.
It almost says that we've endorsed it. Anyway, so the question was something about training. Do I think that firms have approached training in the right way, to use my words? I'd say generally no. Generally no. I think most firms have trained their employees. Which ones? Most have focused on the front line, or to Kate's point, those employees that represent in their mind the highest perceived risk. Yeah. So generally, likely those interfacing with customers. The training probably has been heavily theoretical. A lot of firms out there are working hybrid. The old peer-to-peer learning is massively diluted. That's how we genuinely learn and develop competence. And I think what's actually required for consumer duty, I keep using the phrase where the rubber hits the road, is where one of your customers has an interaction of any sort with one of your employees. And what drives whether or not that customer gets a good outcome is competence, not theoretical training. And theoretical training, ticking a box, is all very well. Yeah, I think it's yesterday's model. And I think firms that are relying on a box ticking exercise are going to be left wanting.
Danger of relying on NPS, Chris?
I think NPS is a valid metric and it does link to customer outcomes and experience. However, it's definitely not a panacea to prove that you're delivering good customer outcomes. It needs much more thought and checking that all your KPIs pass the so what test. Does it link to customer outcomes? Yes or no? NPS alone doesn't.
And because I like making sure that Adrian is cross-eyed by this diagram, I'm going to still stick to this slide on the screen, Zoe. But the feedback loop back into the organization is critical, isn't it? So we talk about the learning and creativity and innovation back into that organization from the first line, front line as well. There is that happening to the expectations of the regulator and firms that you're working with?
I think it is to some extent. So I think it's absolutely imperative that firms are continually evolving their approaches, and then where they're finding that things are not working quite as intended, that they are using the internal learnings and also learnings that are being published by the FCA in the multi-firm review reports, for example, are then being fed back in. I guess one good example we've seen of this recently from our work with a firm is whereby, they've looked at innovative tools such as speech analytics to monitor 100% of their calls to identify indicators of vulnerability. Now, what that does is it means that you're looking at all of the calls rather than a very small selection through your QA process. And it increases efficiency and enables the firm to act quicker in response to issues identified because they've got this tool that supports them in being innovative and identifying those vulnerable customers.
And when you get it right, ta-da! Chris is falling asleep, sorry. This is your chance to shine, Chris. Go on then.
Well, I'm not saying we've got everything right, but we've taken consumer duty seriously, as I'm sure everyone on this call is, and some recognition for our work, I think, is always appreciated. Obviously, we work with Elephants Don't Forget, is one of the key tools that we've used to embed consumer duty across all our employees.
And we talked about it on many webinars to get the outputs and the outcomes that the customer wants, Adrian, and also the regulator wants. It starts off with getting your people trained up to a level of competency to execute that desired culture that you want to see in your firm, and also what customers want to see in your firm.
Yeah, I'll probably come at this from a slightly different perspective. Well, I've on webinars and meeting lots of firms, I hear a lot of chatter around consumer duty is going to cost us money and it's going to suppress our profits. Yeah. And how is it? How can we comply with this? It's not fair, sort of thing. And I know I've a great deal of sympathy for certain markets. Let's go back to those car traders. However, the idea that putting your customer at the center of your organization, treating them honestly and fairly and ensuring they get great customer outcomes is a shit business model is absolutely false. Just look at Apple. Yeah, this is exactly what Apple do. They put the customer at absolutely the center of what they do. And they're the most successful business in the world. So I appreciate that if your business model has been ticking boxes and perhaps doing things that aren't in the best interest of the customer, that journey might be a little bit more bumpy. But the idea that you can't make money and that you can't grow a successful business with this sort of legislation that puts the customer at the center of your business, which is basically what good business is about, is false. And I'm just, everyone on the call can read, right? So we've got plenty of customers who are leveraging consumer duty for considerable economic benefit in their organisations.
And, you know, as the regulator keeps on saying, it's not once and done, Kate. And when you look at it even more forensically, that the FCA quite rightly will be challenging and critiquing and asking for a bit more information. So there's one thing to actually put it in the report. There's another thing to be able to evidence what your findings and recommendations are. And the regulator will be quite interested to see what that looks like there. Do you want to just pick up on a few things that you're already seeing and what the regulator is already asking firms to do?
Yeah, I will. I think the most important thing firms need to bear in mind is that report has to be an honest reflection of where you are today. If you haven't yet met all your MI targets, if you haven't done monitoring in all of your areas, be honest and say it from the start. The way I review Consumer Duty Board reports, and we've looked at quite a lot now, is I take it line by line and I say, what is the statement being made? Can the firm evidence it? And if the FCA asked a question on the back of it, would you be comfortable answering it? So I think you're writing a report that will land with two different sets of eyes. So you're writing it for the board and for them to react and respond, but you're also writing it if you keep in your mind that the regulator may request this at some point if they haven't already. And can I be confident with every statement that I have made? Is there anything in there where I have made a statement that is perhaps not quite the truth? Because I think be your harshest critic is my advice to firms. I think is a really key point. In terms of some of the other points, I think having a reference to culture and what initiatives you've got to support culture, just continuing that theme, is really valuable. And I also think some of the other things is making sure that you have a path forward. So this isn't a look at all this great stuff we've done last year and aren't we brilliant on all of these things? I think the key message is, do you know what? We might still have quite a way to go. If so, how are we going to get there and what do we need to do it? It's an opportunity for firms to say, do you know what? I need more resource here if you want me to deliver here. I need more spend here or investment here if you want me to meet this target. And then that's a decision and the risk appetite of the board to make in terms of how they move forward. But I would particularly say to any kind of compliance individual who are writing their responses, just bear in mind that someone else, i.e. the regulator, may look at it and hold yourself to the fire first.
Zoe, in what you're saying and what you're seeing there, which out of the 9 points would you pick up on and think that firms could probably do better in?
I think the key one for me is the benchmarking. I think what I'm seeing in the board reports is that where MI is presented, it's not being benchmarked against the customer outcomes that the firm has defined. So back to my earlier point around that sort of being forgotten along the journey. I guess the other point that I'm seeing is that where there is MI, that the commentary to support it is actually more focused on the commercial outcome, which is obviously important, but it doesn't really drill down into the customer outcome and applying that customer lens. So one example is, one I've seen recently is MI on missed first payments on a loan, which is a great metric. But what I'm seeing is that the commentary isn't taking that customer angle in terms of thinking, is this an indication that the loans are unaffordable? Have there been any changes made to the affordability assessment that has led to a rise in customers missing their first payment, which isn't an inadvertent consequence? I think it's firms really thinking about what the MI means from that customer perspective.
I like that. And challenge is good, right, Adrian? As submitting your board report, you expect senior managers to have a look at that and to actually push back on some things. That's good. That's good governance.
Yeah, I agree. I'm just thinking about what Zoe said there. I mean, if and I ran a lending business. If my first month's payment data point was going the wrong way, whilst I might look at that and quite legitimately, because I'm a business, yeah, from a business perspective, there's nothing to stop me having another column to establish what might the customer lens be on this situation. So firms have already got this reporting, right? You run but I'm not suggesting for a second, and Zoe isn't either, that you would scrap looking at at this from a commercial point of view. It's the first absolutely thing I'm going to do. I'm going to look at it from a commercial point of view, yeah, because otherwise I won't be here tomorrow. So I need to keep my commercial glasses on, and there's nothing to stop me having a parallel lens to say, and what's the impact on the customer? And I got a massive beef about averages that I learned to my cost when I ran a business with quite a few customers called British Gas. You can look at an average and you can say the average looks quite good. Is 60%. We're doing well. But then when I actually explore the distribution, I find that we've got 2 million customers who are suffering detriment. But don't worry, that's only 10%, Adrian. It's 2 million customers. So averages can mask considerable underlying detriment and failure in your business. So I'm sure everyone knows that, but I just think when you look at averages and you report averages and you've got a big book, beware.
Chris, what type of questions did the board pose or challenge you with?
Well, a number of things, but they obviously dug deep in terms of whether our mortgage intermediaries were all over Consumer Duty, how we were educating them, making sure that that they were pitching the right products and services, that there were challenges around the closed book. I mean, I could go on and on, but yeah, just about all aspects of the duty.
The one thing I would add with that the regulator will ask is, how have you sought assurance that the board have the right skill set and knowledge to challenge that Consumer Duty board report? And that's often something that's forgotten. So have they had the training? Do they have the understanding in order to raise the right questions? Make sure that that is in place is a really key point. Sorry, we're moving on, but yeah, important, I think.
That's a really good call. Really good call. I mean, let's just drill down a bit, because I want to look at in a bit more details outcomes monitoring framework. What's the good, the bad, and the ugly that you see in Kate and Zoe in this area?
I think everything's different. Each firm is different, which is right. It should fit your firm. In terms of good, I think what I've seen from firms is that real customer lens being brought into the MI. So in relation to what Zoe talked about earlier, that if we've got a metric, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You've got a lot of important MI that shouldn't disappear with Consumer Duty. It can be used in both instances, but make sure that the focus of that lens really is the customer when you're looking at it from the Consumer Duty board report, would be my view. I think firms have really brilliant conversations around the board table, and I've listened to lots in terms of, well, what would this mean for this customer, and what would that mean? It isn't always reflected in the minutes, and therefore if I pick up a document, I don't get that flavour from the firm in terms of, oh, the customer was thought about with this. So whenever you're doing metrics or wherever you're doing board reports, make sure that your written presentation is as strong as your verbal discussion as regards where the customer fits within that piece.
And
another point,
go on, Zoe.
I was going to say, just another point to raise there is that I think historically outcomes monitoring has actually sat with the compliance teams who are the backstop for poor customer outcomes, whereby QA frameworks are more around process adherence. And I think if firms haven't already, they need to start looking at outcomes within that QA framework, whether that be that end-to-end journey or looking at a single call or a complaint, and making sure that the customer outcomes are fed through that channel as well.
I mean, there's on that point, there's a great, and I just posted that in the chat, there's a great read across Kate and Zoe around the regulatory's expectations around outcomes monitoring, which was to the insurance industry. Do you want to summarise the key highlights? It probably works its way into the key considerations here as well. Do you want to join the two together, Kate?
Yeah,
What's
sure.
key and also what's expected of all firms?
Yeah, I think that their key observations in terms of that recent report was making sure there is absolute clarity on the metrics that are being used for consumer duty, that effectively that you have a risk-based approach. It's not about monitoring everything all the time. It's about identifying where your key areas of harm are and highlighting those to the relevant body at the correct time. So it's good governance, really, that good governance cycle of finding the issue, escalating the issue, and sorting the issue. That is the ethos of that paper. They don't opine on how many metrics, it's the importance of what you're doing with those metrics and applying a risk-based lens. Don't tell the board every month that, one figure is the same month. What is that used to the board? Tell them when it's changing outside or inside of risk appetite.
A sea of green, as you called it in a recent webinar.
A sea of green. Yeah. I always get a bit suspicious when I see a sea of green.
It might make you feel good, but probably not get the desired feedback that you wish to. Chris, when you looked at and you reviewed the product life cycle and the customer journey in Newbury, were there glitches and issues and challenges that you thought, well, we've got to put a mirror up to ourselves and have a look at ourselves in a bit more close detail?
Yes, I think there's always room for improvement, but we started with the customer journey first, not the product. So we identified around 20 key customer journeys. We prioritised them according to foreseeable harm, measured how many customers were affected by that. We also did an external consumer duty outcome focused survey. We actually asked customers, 2,000 of them, did they feel the outcome they received for a particular product was satisfactory? Were the communications clear? And we tested ourselves against the duty outcomes. From there, we then made changes to the products and services that we offer, and of course looked at our culture as well. So yeah, our view is start with the outside in and work inwards.
I love that. And Zoe, do you want to unpack that in a bit more detail? Because I think that's what you're recommending and supporting clients to do.
I guess there's just a couple of points to raise here. I guess what we're seeing is that as part of the implementation of consumer duty, firms did map out their customer journeys, and they've obviously made changes to the processes since then, but firms don't seem to have gone back and remapped them to check whether there are any areas of foreseeable harm. Just in terms of some good practice that we are seeing some clients do to improve the customer journeys and the product life cycles is target market testing. You're testing your communications with a cohort of your target market to check whether they are, fit for purpose and meeting the consumer duty. So it's just a couple of points.
Just to add to that, I think that's a great point about testing, because the QA team can do a lot of that testing internally with different groups around the organization, but it can also be taken out to customers in focus groups and so on. I think this is really just the start of something rather than the end of something, frankly. There's a lot more to do across the business, across the industry, I think.
And Adrian, when you see a robust outcome testing framework, which Zoe and Kate and Chris have alluded to, then hopefully, with the expectation, and hope not being a strategy, but you should get the desired outcome in terms of customer results. But there seems to be something missing in translation when you look at the recent customer satisfaction surveys, and a disconnect between what the firms think they're doing and what the outputs from the customer feedback point of view is. Where's it going wrong, and why is it going wrong?
How long we got? So I wonder how many firms are operating in a vacuum and not seeing their service standards falling. The UK CSI data says that it's a record low, right, across all sectors. Financial services not covering themselves in glory. The key drivers of this would appear to be, if you park product, would appear to be around service. I'm not getting what I want. The people that I engage with don't know what they're doing, and I feel I'm being let down. I'm being forced down a particular route. The digital, what's called digital first, as the next wave of customer service initiative. Digital first is failing me. We use a phrase called digital on demand, which is probably more appropriate. We talk. I listen to firms. I did a keynote, a customer experience in the financial services sector a couple of weeks ago, and I spoke about this very thing. And after the speech, people came up to me and said, "What do you do when your execs say to you, hide the telephone number? Hide the telephone number so people can't call us, and force them to deal with us by chat." And my advice was, if you go www.apple.com, just send that in an email to your chief exec. First thing on the website is a telephone number. Funnily enough, Apple want to speak to their customers. They put their customers at the center. They don't. Where is the business model that says hide your telephone number, stop your customers from speaking to you? Other than one that ends in Saurus, and is going to be reasonably extinct. Just saying.
I think.
But we're a digital bank, Adrian. You don't understand our business model.
Yeah. See Saurus.
I think what from my perspective, what Consumer Duty is asking firms to do is, firstly, know who your customers are and know what they want. And if you can clearly identify that a digital service is within the appetite and the needs of your customer, then great. So that's what support and understanding is about. It's identifying, what do my customers want in my target market? What support and understanding do they require from us as a business to ensure that that service is designed for their needs? Where do I need to change things? So, for example, if you have a super broad age range in your digital marketing, do you need to do something different for your over 50 segment as opposed to your under 50? Are their expectations different? Do they need a different level of comms? Do you need to change any of the language? That's what the regulator's looking for with Consumer Duty, the ability to flex to meet customers' needs dependent on who your customers are. So,
and Kate, we spoke about this earlier, didn't we? We spoke about it's about when things go wrong, not when things go right.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because funny enough, I get in my car now. When I was a lad and I bought a car, it broke down all the time. I didn't actually expect it to work. Now I get in my car, I expect the thing to work every single time, right? So when it doesn't work, that's, forgive the pun, when the rubber hits the road. So Consumer Duty, I think it's about when it doesn't work. That's the point. That's the point where that's the moment of truth. So it doesn't matter to me whether the channel's digital or whether it's voice or whether I've walked into a Newbury branch. When it goes wrong, that's the moment of truth. And that's the point where you need to make sure your people are competent. Otherwise, that's where the wheels are going to fall off. That was quite a good analogy, wasn't it? The car, the rubber hit the road.
It's as good as my cultural diagram and model.
I've still got a headache.
So we're talking about rubber hits the road, Zoe. How do you go from a works program, which it has been in many organizations, to BAU, where it's absolutely hardwired into the DNA of the organization?
I think one of the key ways is through BMI. So as Kate mentioned earlier about the sea green, I guess what we'd expect firms to do is to regularly review and reassess the thresholds and the limits that are in place. Because I guess where you're seeing a sea of green, that suggests that either the thresholds are too high or that you're not looking at the right MI. I guess another point on the MI piece is around the segmentation of your MI. So as Adrian mentioned, around having those averages, if, for example, you could see that 60% of your customers are happy with a certain thing, I guess it's really drilling down into that 40% to see your cohorts of customers within that and to see whether there's any foreseeable harm to them. One example that we've seen recently is around one firm is separating out the vulnerable customer complaints that it's receiving compared to the non-vulnerable customers, and really highlighting where they're seeing more service issues or lack of support. I guess one thing that we are seeing in that data, I guess, is that the steps taken to remediate those issues that have been identified perhaps aren't there yet, but I think that firm is, heading in the right direction.
And I think that you, picking up on that last point on vulnerability, and Chris, you've had that honesty conversation within Newbury that things can be done better and more effectively?
Yeah, briefly. So board self-assessment's done. We've got 8 work streams and a quarterly plan for the next 12 months. This is just starting. And one of those 8 work streams is around vulnerable customers. We already have some great initiatives already, but it's clear that there's a lot more work to be done. And for example, if it's 50% of your customers at any one time could be vulnerable, we've still got a lot more work to proactively identify who those customers are. So the work's just started in that area.
It's going to become a key focus if it hasn't been already, actually. And somebody would say, quite rightly, Philip, since 2021, it's been a focus of the regulator, but it's through that vulnerability lens that they'll be assessing, Kate, and measuring your approach and attitude to the duty there. Is this going to be the next hurdle that firms are going to be really challenged?
I think the regulator's been quite vocal in the fact that vulnerability is an absolute focus for the next 12 months, and it aligns perfectly to the brief of consumer duty to avoid foreseeable harm. Where's your greatest chance of harm? With your most vulnerable customers. So that aligns to their direction of travel. In terms of, I think where we've seen firms struggle is FCA have a clear view on how many of your customers should be vulnerable based on their financial life survey. If your reported numbers are significantly lower than what their expectation is, you need to have a very good story as to why. And it might be true, but you need the evidence. Evidence is absolutely key here. And I think that is the most important thing firms can do. If you're making a statement, make clear why. Consumer duty is beautifully opaque. There is lots of room for challenge and judgment. So what you just need to be confident of is your own opinion and be able to evidence it. And if you can do that, that's what the regulator are asking you to do, and that's all they're asking you to do, really.
Adrian, I mean, in that paper, good practices and areas for improvement, it said one of the flags, especially when dealing with vulnerable customers, is that observations by the regulator that firms' staff are unable to have complex conversations there. Is there a recognition, therefore, that firms need to review their approach to training as a result of that feedback from the regulator?
You would have thought so. I think there's also a recognition of the fact that quite a few firms on this call will be digital driven businesses. Yeah, so they're channeling customers through that route, and the context of that comment is that when that route goes wrong, the customer's way more triggered. Yeah, so if your digital journey's failed me, and I've wasted a portion of my life trying to get the problem solved with inadequate technology, I'm definitely going to be in a different state of mind. It's not going to be a positive one when I get hold of one of your employees. So the idea of then that employee being able to identify me as being vulnerable is probably negated unless they've been super well trained. And we see a lot of the training has been at a veneer level. And actually, I don't like the phrase vulnerability. Kate and I were having a good discussion about it earlier. For me, it's a label. It's a really negative label. It's got lots of connotations for the customer and for the vendor. I think it's an empathy issue. And I think what we're actually looking at, if your employees were appropriately competent in their role, they would be able to show appropriate empathy and establish whether or not that customer required something different. And that's what vulnerability is about. Does Adrian, by virtue of X, require different treatment? That's the job to be done. And vulnerable tick in a box, my opinion, missing the point.
Yeah. When we look at the MI that your board report, and also that you should be looking at finessing, enhancing, or being able to generate, Zoe, where do you see on the 8 points there that organisations need to do a bit more or work a bit harder on?
I guess for me it would be audience specific. I think, in your board report, I think it's bearing in mind that the audience for the board report is the board, but also the FCA. And I guess it's having the underlying data ready that if the FCA asks for the evidence to support what you've got in your board pack, that it's there waiting and ready to be submitted to them.
Here's what I prepared earlier type of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Chris, paint by numbers, which number? Pick a number, any number.
I think challenging is for me the most important thing. We've talked about it already. I said the so what test. What is the customer lens on that particular KPI that you've chosen? And as Adrian said, I think customer KPIs can coexist with commercial ones.
Yeah, 100%. Good call. Adrian?
Oh,
Think Wheel of Fortune.
yeah, I know. Yes. I'm going to go real-time insights because when I ran a big business, most of the data points we had in the MI that I reviewed in my board pack was lag. Yeah, sorry, was lag indicators. And I would always crave lead indicators. So real-time insights and lead indication, I think, is where you need to be.
And Kate?
Mine is governance. I think you can have the best MI suite, but if it isn't going to the right parties at the right time, it will mean nothing. I spend a lot of time on trains, and I think I constantly hear that: see it, say it, sort it. That is what your MI framework should be. You should be able to identify quickly, and you should be able to respond, and you should be able to mitigate. That is the governance structure that facilitates that.
Provided they're not getting a sea green.
Provided, yeah. Well, it's like, you know, say your vulnerability customers fits where you want to be. How many of them have received a different treatment? What's that next level of MI, you know?
That's the point. Because that's the question you're going to get asked in an audit, and I learned from my painful personal experience. Yeah, it's all very well. Yeah, but then it's, to Chris's point, the so what. Yeah, so that's the thing. And what do you do differently? Tumbleweed. Yeah, that's where you're going to get caught out. So it just needs to be holistic and authentic.
Look, we've covered a lot in a very short period of time, so there is an opportunity to reach out to colleagues at Avyse to actually get that sense check of where you're going. And if you're part of the 30% who are not too sure, or dissatisfied, or highly dissatisfied, or don't know, reach out to them to get an insight about, or another pair of eyes over what you are reporting, and before it obviously has to be rubber stamped by the end of the month there. And also got the opportunity saying, well, look, if you want to sense check whether your training is appropriate, is it suitable, is it actually meeting the customer objectives and the regulators' expectations, then you can actually opt to book a meeting or a call with Clever Nelly there. And obviously you get the opportunity to sign up to our great readership from both Avyse and also Elephants Don't Forget, with podcasts, webinars and such like. And there. Panelists, there's a number of questions that have people pose and comments there. I don't know if you want to get your fingers on buzzers and then shout out any comments or feedback that people have made, either in the chat or also in the questions that they've anonymously posed there. Whilst you cogitate on that, I'm just going to put in, what are you going to do differently at the end of this? And I think that, how are you going to put what we've shared with you into practice? Because it's great talking about these things. You've heard a lot from us, but what are you going to do differently as a result of this? And going back to that challenge, positive challenge that Adrian's made, you know, maybe you should look at board reports. Maybe you should look at your training. Maybe you should look at actually scrutinizing the level of MI and data there. But over to Pax.
Paul, I'm going to answer. I've seen one there that really I think is helpful. Paul has asked, would you consider all customers making an insurance claim as vulnerable, as often the cause was brought on levels of stress? Yes, I would. Do I need to do anything about it? Well, it depends on their circumstances. So the recording of vulnerability is, but by default, they're in a circumstance that makes them present as vulnerable. The second question is, do I need to do anything different because Adrian's had a car crash? No.
Yeah. I think what you need to do, it's your foreseeable harm point. There is an inherent vulnerability, so there is a foreseeable harm. What controls do I need in place to make sure that I'm doing everything I should be for that customer? Because, you know, everybody's lived in experience of vulnerability is different. One person who could have had a crash could be absolutely fine on the back of it. The other person could be suffering some significant financial mental stress. you've got to relate everything back to an individual, which is why vulnerability is not always an easy journey and not always easy to get right.
Okay. Question from Vimbier. Should the percentage age of vulnerable customers be the same across all sectors? As mortgage-only intermediaries, we are unlikely to have up to 50% customers with characteristics of vulnerability at the time of advice.
I think it doesn't have to be the same. Every business is different. What I would say is if your percentage is different to what is stated in Financial Lives, then why is the question you should be asking yourselves. What's different about, and it go back to your target market, what's different about our customer base or our product that means that we have a different percentage of vulnerability?
And can you evidence it honestly?
Yeah.
Can you stand up and say, and here is why?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you can't, it's just rhetoric.
Yeah.
Like one stockbroker saying we don't have any vulnerable customers. Well, on the basis that the King of England presents as vulnerable, I think that's a fail. Does he require special treatment? Well, aside from perhaps being cuddled all the way through the customer journey, no.
How would you define, or how can we define harm or foreseeable harm? Chris, so do you want to chip into that? I'm also going to post a question whilst you answer that to the audience. I'm going to post a question to you, Kate, in the chat, and Adrian, about gaps in monitoring, which I'll share with you briefly.
From a harm or a foreseeable harm perspective, I guess it's looking at your customer base and identifying whether there are instances where some customers may get a different outcome to other customers. So, for example, I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head. So, for example, with your higher risk customers from an affordability perspective, it's looking to see whether your processes, if you have a one-size-fits-all approach, whether that process would actually fit with your higher risk customers, or whether that might lead to foreseeable harm from an affordability perspective, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think on that last question, Philip, do you think it's acceptable to have gaps in your monitoring at this stage? It depends on the reason why. I would like, I don't think anyone's perfect yet. What's really important is that you're honest with where those gaps are in your report and you're doing something to address them. What the regulator is looking for from firms is an honest appraisal. Do I know where my risks are, and can I demonstrate that I am working hard to fix them with a pace that would be aligned to regulatory expectations? That's what they're looking for.
Kate, you are a superstar. I typed a tracy of what you just said. So the key point for me is be honest and tell them how you're going to fix it, right? Yeah. It's a journey. It's year one. No one has to be perfect.
Hey, contrary to all the panelists who said we couldn't get through 30 slides in 60 minutes, we've done it there. So next month, 40 slides. That's right. Remember, it's all about ongoing compliance and there. Look, thank you so much indeed, Chris and Zoe, especially because first timers on this webinar channel. Thank you, the audience as well. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Adrian, for this being good webinar. We'll feed back the slides and also the recording of this webinar to you shortly with a feedback on the polls and the publications. And so, yeah, please do reach out to colleagues at Avyse as well as Clever Nelly if you want support, guidance and support as well, and thank you very much indeed, Adrian, for bringing your fan zone with you.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah.
Take care, everyone. See you later.
Take it easy. Thank you.